shared, currently the i18n APIs are available on the client. This is making the same ones available on the server by moving them to shared. So why do we want to do this? One thing is, in the about 5 years since we built most of these, we've learned a lot, and so we can improve the APIs as part of this. We want to be able to share code between the client and server, so you don't write code that renders it one way on the server and one way on the client, and also that we get the same rendering. So for example, AdWords ran into this problem when they were rendering using ICU4J on the server and using GWT on the client, that they didn't always render exactly the same way. And eventually they actually wound up doing most of that rendering on the server and shipping down strings to avoid that problem. There's also a lot of features in the GWT i18n APIs which are not available in many of the other libraries, like ordinal support, things like that. We also want to take the advantage of this opportunity to add the ability for multi-locale support in an app. Like right now, a GWT app can only be running in one locale at a time. You don't have reference to rendering in another locale at all. If you're writing, say, a translation app, that's problematic, or maybe even a word processor, that you want to be able to have German text in the middle of English text. You would like to be able to know what the German locale rules are.
It actually is essential on the server. So, yeah.
Well, if the server is backing up a web app, you may only be running one at a time for most apps. And then another thing is the existing APIs. There's a lot of property files that are used, and we generate the GWT Java files at compile time, or when you're in dev mode, when you hit the GWT create. We run a generator to generate the code from that. And we can make that a lot faster and more efficient if we just generate all the Java code up front and let the GWT compiler do the job of doing dead code elimination. All right, so what will this include? Basically, everything that's not message formatting. Initially, we still won't have the messages, so if you use messages, constants with lookup, those won't be there, but everything else will. So date formatting, number formatting, calendar, currency list, etc. Eventually, what we'll be doing is adding a build time code generator that will take your messages interfaces and produce localized versions of those for the server. And we use the existing server-side localizable support. So you just GWT create your messages class, and it will load the correct one. All right, so the top-level APIs, all this will be accessible under the Google GWT i18n shared package. Locales has all the information about all the locales. So this is things like getting the available locales, asking if any of the configured locales have RTL support, and also getting individual locale info instances. So for a particular locale, the current one, or if you're a multi-locale app and you want to know what the locale info for German is. Locale info is all the things specific to a locale. So it's the entry point for how to get the currency list for this locale, the locale display names, number formatting rules, date formatters, etc. One thing that we haven't completely figured out is the best practices for how to get these. A common practice, which we'll talk about later, is storing these instances in a static field. So a common practice inside Google, you have a messages for your class defined in that class, and then you store in a static field the GWT create result. That doesn't work very well in this, and so we want to figure out the best way of doing this on the server. For example, perhaps using a juice request scope, but we don't want to set it up where you have to be using juice in order to use this. So we'll have to figure that out. The lower level things, so once you have a locale info instance, these are the things you can get specifically about that locale. You can get a datetime format factory, which you can use to generate all the different types of datetime formatters. There's standard ones for if you want whatever that locale's idea of a short date format is, you can get it from the datetime format factory. You can also get more complicated, you can specify more detail about what kind of formatter you want. You can get the list of currencies that are all localized to this particular locale. You can get locale display names. So, for example, for a locale selector that you would show in your app. You can get all the region names. And since JavaScript currently doesn't have very good collation support, and you don't have to sort these in a locale that may not be the browser's native locale, we actually provide them already sorted. So you can produce them in the correct order, and there's also a list of the regions that are most likely for a given locale. So if the current locale is English, then US is going to be at the top of the countries most likely to have that.
Not Azerbaijan and Afghanistan.
Right.
The US at the very bottom.
Right. Likewise, if you're in Arabic, well, then US isn't going to show up on the top list. It's going to be a bunch of Arabic countries. Number format factory is similar to datetime format factory. You can get a percent format, a decimal format, and those would get the locale specific formatter. For example, if you're formatting in Japan, the currency format by default is going to be 0 decimal places, where in the US it's going to be 2 decimal places. You can also supply a format pattern and get exactly what you want. There's even lower level APIs, and most of the time you're not even going to worry about these. If you're doing your own message formatting, or if you're writing a date picker widget, things like that, you might actually have to worry about these. So like datetime format info, that'll have the names of the months and days. It'll have what is considered the first day of the week to show on the calendar, things like that. List patterns would be if you have a list of things. So in English, you would typically put, you would list all of them separated by commas, and then the last element. If you have just 2, it would be Joe and Bob, and no comma in there at all. So the rules about how to build that. Other locales will have different separators instead of commas. They'll have different rules, different text for the separator words, things like that. Number constants have things like how do you represent infinity, nan, what's the decimal separator, the grouping separator, things like that. Ordinal rules let you, ordinal is if you're counting things. So like this example would be 121st Street is if your number is 121, you want to show with ST. If it's 122, you want to show 122nd Street, things like that. So all those rules vary by locales, and you don't want to have to embed that code into your app of which locale gets which rules. You can get the ordinal rule and not have to worry about it. Likewise, with plural rules, English has only 2, Arabic has 6. It actually has up to 8 if you want the more complex.
Polish has some kind of insane ones where it's like if it's like 1 mod 12 or something. There's like all these weird rules about.
Yeah, Welsh has a really weird one, etc. And then isRTL will tell you if this is a right-to-left language that you're running in. So, for example, many of the widgets will, by default, do things differently if you're in RTL. So, if you're writing a widget, you may well need to know about isRTL. All right, so here's an example of the problem that we talked about earlier. So this is a common pattern that's used in a lot of code, both inside Google and out. And what happens is the CL-init for this that evaluates the static initializer only gets executed once. You evaluate git create then, and then the next time even if this request has a different locale on the server than the last request, you're still getting the first instance that was created. So, if we had a way that we could create something besides a literal, then we could solve this by having an intermediate class that on the client would just do a GWT create, and on the server it would do like in a thread local or some other per locale cache of what these instances are. So one option would be to do some work in the compiler. There's been discussions on this before. You have to be careful though. You have to make sure that it can always resolve to a class literal after inlining, and you want to make sure that you get good error messages in the case that it's not. All right, so the roadmap of doing this is there's work in progress for all this. It's basically done. There's a problem with API checker I'm working on, and then we can get that committed. Then the existing code generator for messages uses a really, it's some of the older code in the i18n stuff, and I have a working proof of concept that replaces that with a much cleaner message API that for processing the messages and then generating the code from it. So that shouldn't take too much longer. And then the pseudo-localization support, if you're not familiar with that, that's the idea of mechanically generating translations that expose particular problems. So for example, you might forget to localize some of the strings in your app, and the pseudo-localization will show those because they'll be the only strings that don't have accents in them. Or maybe you concatenate two messages from the translator together, which is a bad thing because say if I take one message that's translated separately, concatenate it with a second message, the translator doesn't ever get to see those together. You might have to reorder things between them depending on the language. And so by putting brackets around individual messages, you can detect that error. Another example is German generally has strings about twice as long as English, and so you don't necessarily leave enough space in your UI for it. So pseudo-localization is a way of detecting a lot of localization errors early before you take the expense of sending it off to get translated, and you get your translation back and you find out, oh wait, this string is way too long, that won't work. And so right now there's an open source pseudo-localization tool from Google that you can use, but you have to do all the work of hooking it in yourself. And so one thing I want to do, which the redoing the message generator will allow, is hooking that directly in, so that just by importing a GWT module, you'll be able to run the pseudo-localizer directly. And here's the URL if you want to see this presentation. Any questions?
Can you talk a little bit more about the timeline for the roadmap?
Okay, so I'm working on this in my spare time, so things have taken longer than I've expected so far. But basically, getting the shared APIs committed is right now blocked only on an API checker bug. At least I think it's a bug in the API checker. It might be something in what I did. So I don't think that will be more than a few weeks. Beyond that, we're probably talking into the summer for the message generation code.
And this is just you working on it. And are you planning on rolling it out at Square?
No.
GWT isn't used currently at Square.
Okay, I didn't know.
This is all purely voluntary, so you shouldn't be asking about when you're going to do this.
I'm sorry?
I'm just kidding.
Well, we've got a project that is just moving to a second language, so bilingual support for Spanish, and I didn't know if maybe we could help on, or you'd even recommend to try this with the project that we're working on currently.
So you mean you're adding a second language support, and you need server side support.
Potentially, yes.
So the messages that'll be a good bit longer. So if you need that in the short order, that probably won't work for you. There are some solutions out there now for server-side messages. Yeah, that would take. I've seen there's reflective proxy implementations, and there's also a code generator implementation. I'd have to look up the details of it.
You mean somebody using Java Lang Reflect proxy around the message interface?
Right.
Oh, okay.
I didn't hear what you said.
Oh, someone probably wrote a Java Lang Reflect proxy sitting around the message interface in GWT, which basically means you can get when someone tries to invoke it, you can get an intercepted method call and then supply the implementation on the fly. So if like get, format first name or something, then you basically intercept it and implement it in the proxy.
Yeah, the problem with that one is it's the reflection is kind of slow. You've got to ship the property files on the server, and then the bigger problem is the inconsistency between rendering on the client and the server.
Okay, I look forward to looking at
If
it.
the person were to have the same version of ICU4J as the same CLBR version, would it actually sync up? Or is there other things?
It will generally be close, but I haven't found a case yet where there was an exact match.
Why is that if they're the same?
Well, because there have been bugs in one or the other, or slightly different CLDR revisions. So like ICU4J ships the next version. They chose the version of CLDR that was available at that time. But the CLDR was updated whenever it was updated, and they don't necessarily ever match on the same version of CLDR.
I don't really get what the problem with the server-side localization is. So why do you need the advanced technology? Or do you know in the session what?
Fast initial load is one of them. So you hit the page before you download the GWT app. The initial render is basically done on the server, shipped down on the server. Like for example, Gmail will do this. So you hit your Gmail inbox, and this is not Gmail's not written with. This is done with the Closure library, but the initial inbox basically is rendered via a server-side template. It's a static HTML,
Okay.
and then so by the time you actually go to click on and open something, it's been downloading the code in the background. And then it re-renders it behind the scenes, but it re-renders it with a 100% exact match. So you actually don't see the fact that there's no flicker or flash between the two versions.
Or also imagine your server wants to send out email to the user and using the locale that they're logged in. You want the number to be formatted the same way they saw it on the screen.